killer didn't move Jinho. He believed that the modern world was definitely more sensitive to death. In Zhongyuan, such incidents would not have attracted anyone's attention. Why was he so different? It has to be the same people. Jinho pointed the remote at the TV and turned it off. He went to the window and looked outside. Life in the hospital was wearing him out. Downstairs, he saw police officers running into the hospital through the main entrance. Jinho didn't understand what had happened. He went down from his room to the first floor of the hospital. As he walked down the corridor a bit, he came across a crowd of people. They talked about a serial killer and the fact that he had taken a child hostage. Jinho thought that strange things were happening. Then he remembered the guy with the bloody leg, and he thought that maybe he was the murderer that people were talking about. But Jinho decided it was none of his business, and he was better off going back to his room before he got involved. He was about to leave when suddenly he heard a child's voice. Jinho changed his mind and began to make his way through the crowd. Afterward, he saw the same guy he saw in the hospital with a bloody leg, and this guy, with a surgical scalpel in his hand, was holding Jian hostage. The detective tried to calm the killer and convince him to turn himself in before things got any worse. The detective offered the killer to surrender, and in exchange he promised to commute his sentence. Afterwards, the killer approached Detective Li Zhongyan and said he thought they knew each other better. The killer said he was disappointed in the detective because he thought such negotiations would work. The killer brought a scalpel to Jian's neck and pressed the blade on her neck, which gave the girl a wound that began to ooze blood. The killer told the detective that they should have known him better. He said the cops had to know what he was going to do if those were going to buy time, as they were doing now. The detective yelled at the killer to stop. He understood that the perpetrator was enjoying the situation. The detective understood that he should not stimulate him in this way. If he made the wrong call, in the worst-case scenario, the perpetrator would kill the child and run away. He had to stall for time while others set everything up outside. The killer then demanded that they open the way, or else he threatened to cut the child's hand. The killer put the scalpel to the girl's wrist and added that he had read in a book that people die when they lose about 30% of their blood. Jian shouted. The killer said that if you cut an artery, people had from 3 minutes to an hour to live. He added that he didn't think he could control how much blood the girl would lose, but he promised to try his best. After all, she was a precious hostage. The killer gave the policeman one last warning to get out of the way. The detective ordered that the perpetrator be allowed to pass. The cops were confused at first, but the detective explained to them that they had to save the child's life first. The cops parted and opened the way for the killer to leave the hospital. The criminal walked past the cops, leading the hostage, and was glad to have beaten these idiots again. Why didn't they know that abandoning the child was the easiest thing for him to do? Survival of the fittest. The laws and ethics of society are for the weak. In the end, the strong survive and the weak die. And this time, thought the criminal, he survived again. Suddenly, other footsteps were heard. Walking toward the exit, the killer was satisfied with himself, wondering how many more he could kill. Suddenly, the killer was blocked by Gang Jinho. Jian was extremely surprised by his action. The detective asked Jinho to get out of the way. But Jinho didn't even listen to him. He looked the killer straight in the eyes. The murderer was a little confused. Then the perpetrator himself decided to look into the guy's eyes and was immediately frightened. He saw a monster. The killer suddenly felt his body disobeying him. The monster was getting closer and closer. It was getting closer, and there was nothing the killer could do about it. He screamed, begging the monster to stay back, begging him not to do it. Jinho approached the murderer, who in the meantime had already hidden behind his hostage and was trembling with fear, and asked for the girl's release. The killer clenched his teeth and made a sharp lunge toward Jinho. At this point, because of his abnormal experience, the suspect's judgment clouded, causing him to make the child kidnapper's worst mistake. He left the child and rushed at Jinho with a surgical scalpel. The people around me were dumbfounded. A scalpel fell tinkling on the tiled floor. The detective's jaw dropped. The killer, with horror in his eyes, stood with his arm twisted back at the elbow. He did not immediately understand what had happened, but when he got it, when he felt the savage pain, he screamed at the top of his lungs. His right arm was hanging out like strings. After that, Jin-ho kicked him in the face, and the killer fell to the floor unconscious. While the assembled people and cops were recovering, Jin-ho walked up to Jae-yeon, stroked her on the head, and asked how she was feeling. At first, the girl couldn't get a word out, but then she burst into tears as she realized the horror she had endured. The detective ordered the arrest of the killer. After all this, the detective invited Jin-ho in for a talk. He asked him if he had demonstrated a taekwondo technique or something similar. The detective told Jin-ho that he was lucky the hostage was okay. If things had gone wrong, it would have been his fault. The girl's parents would have blamed the detective, and the media would have said on every channel that the useless cops had let the man die, and his family would have ignored him because he was a bad father. The detective then looked at Jin-ho, who sat before him with completely blank eyes, and asked him if he had listened to him at all. Jin-ho apologized. The detective asked if he knew this child. Gang Jin-ho replied that he was indebted to the girl. It seemed incredible to the detective that Jin-ho suddenly decided to act like a hero. Afterwards, the policeman thanked Jin-ho, because without him, they might not have caught that killer. After that, Jin-ho decided to preach to Jae-yeon and came to her room, where there was a nurse besides them. Jae-yeon was lying in bed, hooked up to several IVs. She was asleep. The nurse asked Jin-ho if this was the first time he had seen Jae-yeon in such a condition. Then she added that the girl had had a seizure right after the incident. The nurse said that the girl looked for Jin-ho before she fell asleep. She said she was very frightened, but he made her calm down. Jin-ho asked the nurse if Jae-yeon was in pain. The nurse responded that the seizures were very painful for the girl. Jae-yeon tries to hide them, but it was very sad to see her try. The nurse said that Jae-yeon asked me to give him something and gave the boy a can of Coke. The nurse added that Jae-yeon had somewhere else to go and asked Jin-ho if he could take care of the girl before her mother arrived. Jin-ho took a can of Coke and said he would take care of Jae-yeon. After receiving an answer, the nurse left the room. Jin-ho looked at the red can of Coke and said that he owed Jae-yeon one more time. He reasoned that, after all, this child also just wanted to live a normal life, just like him. Jin-ho decided to pay Jae-yeon back and then put his right hand on her stomach. Suddenly, a magical light appeared from Jin-ho's hand. The light turned into a powerful flash. Jin-ho told himself that living a normal life was more difficult than he thought. Jin-ho opened the tin and greedily sipped his favorite drink. Gang Jin-ho and Jae-yeon were sitting on a wooden bench in the hospital courtyard talking. Jae-yeon told him that she was surprised when he showed up like that. She said that Jin-ho was like a knight in shining armor at that moment. Jae-yeon then said that she had heard about Jin-ho being discharged the next day. In this, she was very jealous of him. She told him that she wished she had been in his shoes. Jin-ho said that the nurse told him that Jae-yeon was getting better. The girl answered that she was indeed feeling better. She was usually sick 4 or 5 times a day, but she had been better since yesterday, and the doctor told her she would be able to leave the hospital soon too. Jae-yeon thought that her heart was so overwhelmed by the incident that it had forgotten how to ache. Jin-ho understood that that was not why she had stopped hurting. It seemed that her ki flow had returned to normal. Jae-yeon thanked Jin-ho and asked him not to come back to the hospital again. She told him that she hoped to meet him somewhere away from the hospital. After that, they bumped cans of Coke. When he went back for the first time in years, there was a house welcoming him. The aroma of my mother's cooking was in the air. And then there was my sister. The young brunette sat across from him at the table and didn't understand what was wrong with her brother. She told Jin-ho that not only was he hit by a car, but she also heard him trying to be a hero in the hospital. She kept asking her brother what was wrong with him, and why couldn't he just stay abnormal, if only for a little while? But Jin-ho was thinking about his own things and hardly listened to his sister. Gang Yan-yeon, She was his younger sister. She went to Japan to several agencies to become a celebrity or something like that back in the day. Apparently, it was still going on. His mother reassured herself that her son had saved the child, which meant that all was well. Gang Yun-young exclaimed, shouldn't her mom have scolded Jinho for doing such things? The mother replied to her daughter that she had already scolded Jinho, so she hoped he would not do anything as dangerous again. She told Eun-young not to bother her brother, and she told Jinho to get ready for school. Eun-young responded to her mother by saying that she was always on her son's side. Jinho went into his room. When he opened his closet, he saw his school uniform in it. It looks like he will have to go to school if he wants to live a normal life. School is a peaceful age. He was looking forward to it. The next day, Jinho went to school. His first day of school coincided with a midterm exam. Together with his classmates, he solved problems, passed the exam. Jinho didn't know the answers to any of the questions. His last day of school was 50 days ago. Of course, he didn't remember anything. However, his life had taught him a few tricks, and he still remembered how to deal with these situations. The exam was over. For Jinho, it was harder than practicing martial arts. After the exam, 3 classmates approached Jinho. One of them said that Jinho had a creepy face all class. He apologized that they hadn't visited him in the hospital because they supposedly didn't know what hospital he was in. It was Jun Yingyu, a tall guy with brown hair. Jinho remembered this guy, but he didn't remember the other 2. Jun In-yu seemed to think that Jinho was still angry, so he suggested that he go to the computer lab. He said he would pay for Jinho, so enough of that stone face. The guys came to the computer room. On the way, Jun In-yu said that he would pull everyone out today, so he asked his friends not to troll him. Jinho recalled that their foursome often played together. He wondered how long it had been since he last had a moment like this. It looked like a normal life, and now it seemed real to Jinho. The guys were walking down the hall, joking with each other and laughing. Despite his turmoil, Jinho was able to adjust to the modern world relatively quickly. Hanging out with my friends in the computer room. I got it from teachers because of bad grades. And he bonded with his family members while watching late-night television. He seemed to have hope because of this peaceful life that one day the red demon master inside him would wither away and he could live the normal life of Gang Jinho. And just like that, time flew by peacefully. Jinho had problems with his studies. He didn't understand anything. He had to go back to studying the elementary school materials. The next exam was a month and a half away. Jinho thought it should be impossible to raise his high school level in such a time. In the school corridor, Jun In-yu caught up with Jinho and told him that he saw him coming out of the teacher's lounge. Apparently he was not doing well at all. Jun Yingyu suggested that Jinho surrender, which he did. Jungyu mockingly whispered in Chunho's ear that his gamer skills were terrible too. He needed to start training. Jun Yingyu annoyed Jinho. He just wanted to shake him off. Suddenly, there was the sound of a chair falling to the floor. Next to the school cubicles, several kids bullied a schoolboy. They complained that he had forgotten to bring them something. Jinho never thought he would remember anyone so vividly, but the main school bully, named Choi Young-soo, he remembered. Most importantly, he remembered that even the teachers could not touch him because he was the grandson of the school's benefactor. He bullied that kid for fun and showmanship. Jinho felt sorry for the guy, but he saw no reason for himself to help him. He wanted to study and stand outside, not get involved. Choi Young-soo called the boy a lame freak and then kicked him on the back. Choi Young-soo yelled at the boy. He asked if he was really lame or was he just pretending to get attention. One of Choi Young-soo's henchmen brought him a bucket of water in which to wash his rags. Choi Young-soo told the boy to take a bucket of dirty water and pour it on the teacher. Only then he promised to leave him alone. The poor kid begged for help in his heart. But no one even wanted to pay attention to it. The poor kid was sitting on the floor, trembling with fear, when Choi Young-soo kicked him with a bucket of dirty water. Choi Young-soo called the kid a lame loser and kicked the bucket of water, which then toppled over. The guy didn't understand why he had to go through all this. What had he done to deserve this attitude? Was it because of his limp? Suddenly, Junho stepped in for the kid and stood beside him. He told Choi Young-soo and his guys to stop bullying the guy. Jinho stood up for the guy and stood in the way of Choi Young-soo and his two henchmen. Choi Young-soo asked Jinho who he was. Jinho told Choi Young-soo that it was already too much. Choi Young-soo wondered what kind of dumbass was in front of him. Jinho told the guy to go back to his seat. The kid replied that he was fine as it was. But Jinho insisted and asked not to be forced to repeat himself twice. Choi Young-soo didn't like that. He called Jinho a bastard and slapped him. Choi Young-soo swung again and asked Jinho before he struck, why the fuck was he even helping that creep? Was he jealous that no one was paying attention to him? Choi Young-soo tried to hit Jinho a second time, but he intercepted the blow, catching his opponent's arm. And then Choi Young-soo didn't feel so confident anymore. Jinho told him that from now on, anything that happens will only be his fault. Choi Young-soo didn't understand why he couldn't move while Jinho held his hand. He yelled at Jinho to get away from him. Choi Young-soo then managed to kick Jinho, but it was as if the latter did not feel the blow. Jinho grabbed Choi Young-soo by the neck with his other hand, jerked him sharply to his side, and hit him with his knee under the breath. After that, Jinho gave Choi Young-soo a final punch to the face. He fell unconscious face first into a puddle of muddy water. The two henchmen immediately rushed to pick up their defeated leader. They took Choi Young-soo under their arms and started to carry him away as quickly as possible. But then Jinho asked them the question, who allowed them to leave. Jinho told them to clean up the mess Choi Young-soo made. After that, Jinho returned to his seat and sat down at his desk. Behind him sat Jun Min-yu. He asked his friend where he learned to swing his legs like that and why he got into this fight in the first place. Jung In-yu told him that Choi Young-soo was the chairman's grandson. Jinho replied to him that he was aware of it. Jun In-yu couldn't understand why Jinho would get into a fight if he knew who Choi Young-soo was. Even the teachers tried not to annoy him unnecessarily. Jinho replied to his friend that he wasn't afraid of that, and that he might be scolded for fighting. Suddenly, a kid came up to them, and Jinho stood up for him. He thanked Jinho and immediately apologized for involving him in his problems. Jinho replied that he didn't do it because of the kid, so he didn't think the kid should thank him. He punched Choi Young-soo because he just didn't like it when that kind of thing happened. After that, Jinho told the guy to leave. The boy was upset by this answer from Jinho and went back to his room. Jinho slammed his fist on the desk. He pondered the fact that if he hadn't held back, Choi Young-soo wouldn't have been left a wet spot. He was lucky this time, but Jinho wasn't sure if the next time would be the same. It looks like he still hasn't gotten out of the habits of his past life. Later, Jinho was called to the teacher's lounge. There, Jinho had a conversation with one of the teachers. They were sitting opposite each other. The teacher had a wooden stick in his hand to bring up disobedient students. The teacher asked Jinho how he dared to beat a student on school grounds, and was he aware that Choi Young-soo had been sent to the hospital after his prank. He also asked how Jinho could even raise his hand against an innocent child. Jinho replied that Choi Young-soo didn't hit an innocent child, but someone who bullied Park Yoo-min. The teacher asked Jinho to repeat what he had just said. Jinho replied that everyone in the class was a witness. The teacher said that he heard that Choi Young-soo didn't touch Jinho. Gang replied that it wasn't like that at all. He added that he was more than sure the teacher knew everything, and asked him if he had anything to say to that. The teacher began to threaten Jinho with a stick, but he told him that he would accept punishment, but only if Choi Young-soo got his way for bullying Yoo-min, but he certainly didn't agree with touching someone who was innocent. The teacher told Jinho that he was in no position to dictate terms. He said he already knew who the bully was, so the teacher decided to teach him a lesson.